So, I'm going to give a little introduction, obviously just scraping the surface of Luke's Gospel. There are some, obviously some particularly key themes of Luke are being much further explored by Isabel, James and Alex, and I will treat those even more briefly. So, Luke's Gospel. What are we talking about here? It is, you know, like euthanasia or eulogy. It's the good thing, and the angelos is the message. Well, you is what it's supposed to mean. You thanatos, good death. However you interpret that. It springs to mind currently. Anyway, so here we go. So you can see the word angel in here, angelion, the message, the messenger. So it's the good news, the gospel. We usually speak these days of the Gospel of Luke, or Luke's Gospel, or Matthew, Mark, etc. If we've been brought up in the BCP, we will know that we always used to say, the Gospel according to. And there's a sense in which that is actually more precise, because of course it's one Gospel, albeit presented to us by the four different Gospel writers. How did the Gospels come about? They have been called passion narratives with long or with extended introductions. We think that was really the core of how the Gospels started, with telling the story of what happened, how it came about, that Jesus died, and then the other bits, that obviously it developed further. There's been a lot of discussion on whether the Gospel is a biography. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute. But the fact that I've written, it said here this little thing that Jesus saves. The Gospel is the good news that Jesus saves. That's actually something quite specifically Lucan. Again, I'll come back to that. Jesus as the Saviour is particularly prominent in Luke's Gospel. So, the Gospel as a biography. The ancient biographies at the time of antiquity were memorials. Here we go. How the great man should be remembered, because they were men that they were remembered in this way. It was about their character. It was about them being heroes, so their lives should be imitated. It's about their death, and it's about the biography was selective and creative in what it told us about the person's character and purpose. So ancient biographies describe the birth, teaching, actions and death of a worthy individual so that others might learn from them. And I think that's clearly is in the background of the genre of the Gospels. Some New Testament scholars have tried to argue quite strongly that the Gospel is a unique genre compared to ancient biographies. Now there are differences to ancient biographies. Whether you have to say they are completely unique is perhaps saying something a little more about our interest in saying that Jesus was unique. But there we go. So, what was Luke's unique contribution as he wrote the Gospel? Well, it begins with the story of Jesus. There's the census, there's the nativity, but oops, not, of course, with the Magi, no donkey in sight, no camel in sight. The angel speaking to the shepherds. The story of Jesus with Anna and Zechariah in the temple. And, oops, what's happened here? There we go. and the 12-year-old in the temple. Those are particular stories that Luke highlights. I'll have some more in a minute. But the question is, where was Jesus born? And if we look at the differences between Matthew and Luke's infancy narratives, I think with Christmas coming up, that's quite a nice thing to do, to look at this more closely and learn a little bit more about what Luke's particular interests were. So note first of all that Luke is the Gentile Christian. He doesn't go back in the DNA, apart from the fact that it's the other way around, he doesn't go back to Abraham, but he goes back to Adam, to God. That nonetheless, of course, he affirms that Scripture is, the ancient Scriptures, the Hebrew Scriptures, the Scriptures of Israel, are part of divine revelation. And he also affirms that Jesus is of human flesh, that his birth, his circumcision, Joseph listed as the father here. And the fact that Jesus was really, really, really a real human, and that the Hebrew Scriptures are part of our heritage of faith, both these matters were hotly contested in the early 2nd century, which is why a lot of scholars think that that's the time where we might want to date Luke's Gospel. Matthew offers magi, Gentile astrologers responding to a star who worship King Jesus. And this Gentile adoration is perhaps mirrored in the centurion at Jesus' death in Luke's Gospel. I think this would be too early for Luke to already speak of the Gentile, because he's got this grand scheme of how it goes from Galilee to Jerusalem to the world. So he can't have that at this stage. We have a much more humble depiction of the birth in Luke's Gospel. You know, that the Magi bring expensive gifts. Luke offers humble shepherds who respond to that angelic annunciation. And I said, well, where was Jesus born? Matthew and Luke explain the move from Bethlehem to Nazareth in very different ways. For Luke, the family home is in Nazareth, and the journey to Bethlehem is just a temporary measure, inconvenient because of the census. Matthew's Gospel seems to imply that Mary and Joseph lived in Bethlehem and only settled in Nazareth after Jesus' birth and stayed in Egypt. And we're as sure as we can be that when Jesus entered public ministry, his hometown was Nazareth. That's how he was known, the Nazarene. Luke presents the census as the reason for Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. There is, though, a bit of a problem about the date of the census in this way. It doesn't tie in with Luke's implication that it took place under Herod the Great. But of course what's important is the theological significance of Jesus being born in Bethlehem. It presents Jesus as the Messiah. You know that from our carol service readings. The prophet Micah expects the Messiah to be born in Bethlehem, and it connects Jesus with David, because Bethlehem is the city of David. So some scholars conclude that it's unlikely that Jesus was in fact born in Bethlehem because of the different reasons given by Luke and Matthew for Bethlehem as the birthplace. Problems with Luke's historical framework and the seeming implication in Mark and John that Jesus was born in Nazareth. The obvious theological interest in linking Jesus with Bethlehem may have led some early Christians to say, well, that's how we understand this. And that means that the gospel writers' theological beliefs would have shaped the details of the nativity story. Now, we're always talking, whenever we're talking about history, whether you're talking about Alexander the Great or Jesus or the French Revolution, we're always talking about historical probabilities. There is nothing that you can absolutely say 100% certain, because none has been there. There is a counter-argument that the tradition placing Jesus in Bethlehem for his birth appears to be very old, and there is good support in the Gospels for Jesus being of Davidic family. we now assess these infancy accounts as history or as theological storytelling that really isn't primarily interested in telling you precisely what happened, which is a very kind of Enlightenment idea. The question is, so what? Why is Luke saying it like this? That seems to me to be the really important question. How does that help us understand the rest of the Gospel? I think that's a really good question to ask, which can also help us overcome the many different views that scholars have in the way they evaluate these texts. And there will be differences between the way Alice and James and Isabel and I might see and interpret and understand certain passages. But in the end, and I think that's important that we do, that we wrestle with these texts, but ultimately I think what really matters is that we then, for our preaching, don't get hung up on that, but ask, so what? Why is Luke saying it like this? How does this help us understand the rest of the Gospel? How does this help us understand what Luke absolutely wanted to tell us? So back to some other unique stories in Luke's Gospel. Of course, women. So you have here the Annunciation and Visitation. You have Mary and Martha, Luke 10. You have the bent over woman, Luke 13. You have Luke 8, the rich women supporting Jesus. And there are a lot of couplets as well. There's Simeon and Anna. There's Elizabeth and Zechariah. There's Mary and Joseph. There's the 12 and certain women. There's Joseph of Arimathea and the Galilean women. There's male and female servants in the parable, Luke 12, the beaten. There's Simon the Pharisee and the sinful woman. There's the healing of a demon-possessed man and Peter's mother-in-law. There's Sabbath healings in Luke 13:14, first with man, then with woman. There's a man planting a seed. There's a woman baking with yeast. There's a man losing a sheep. There's a woman losing a coin. So that seems to be really quite intentional in the way Luke depicts this. Other specialties. We know, of course, about the Sermon on the Plain. We know about the Nazareth Manifesto. But there are four, for me, I think there are sort of the four faves for Luke, which if we've been lucky enough to be to Sunday school, would have encountered there. There's the rich man and poor Lazarus. There is the Zacchaeus. There is up in the tree. There's the Good Samaritan, and there is the prodigal son. Perhaps also unique to Luke, but much less loved, is the parable of the unjust steward. You know, the one that defrauds his master. That's generally the one when preachers like to look up, I wonder what the epistle is. So let me just say a couple of sentences about this. I think the parable is asking the fundamental question, what is the value of money? Because it's there for a purpose. It's not an end in itself. The dishonest manager realizes that generosity is the best investment. And this is actually then endorsed. And the other thing to say, I think one shouldn't over-interpret the parable, any parable. Like a joke, parables generally have one punchline, which render much of the story detail ultimately redundant. You know, details that have been offered in the run-up that get us interested in the story. But what actually matters is that punchline. It's like when you tell a story about the man who got a train to Manchester and then this happened. In the end, it doesn't actually matter whether it was a train to Manchester or to London. It's that punchline that matters. Trying to find meaning in all the ancillary description of the story only lends itself to missing what the actual point is, because they're parables, not allegories, where every bit means something. So further on, finally, of course, the much beloved Emmaus story, only in Luke, and the Ascension story, which reminds us, of course, that it's talking of Luke's Gospel is a little bit difficult, though I've tried to discipline myself, without talking of Acts, which is part of that double volume that we find in our New Testament. So that's a very brief overview how Luke's Gospel, I've stolen this obviously, how Luke's Gospel is put together. You know, the whole beginning story, and I haven't really said much about John the Baptist, but there we go. Lord's birth, the preparation, the mission in Galilee, the Lord's mission towards Jerusalem. That is probably the main addition to Mark's Gospel that Luke makes, this travel narrative. It's one chapter in Mark's Gospel, and in Luke's Gospel, it's almost 10 chapters. When the days draw near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. That's Luke 9:51, and then that opens the door to this whole travel narrative about Jesus travelling and everything that happens. And then, of course, we know that the entry to Jerusalem, the passion narrative, and the resurrection and ascension, because we're talking Luke's Gospel. Again, and something else I've stolen, I don't 100% agree with it, but it's the closest I could get that was easily visible. The timeline for New Testament books and letters. So what the key thing to remember here is the pivotal event of the year 70, when around the destruction of the temple. That meant Judaism had to transition from a religion of the temple to a religion of the book. It meant the separation from Judaism for the early Christians and the rise of Gentile Christianity. And of course that's all spelt out, especially in the book of Acts. I'd probably put Mark after 70, but other valued company may disagree with that, as she says, looking at James. Because that means Mark would have known about the destruction of the temple, and then Luke much later than that. This is a very, very traditional, and I almost feel like it shows me it's a dinosaur of New Testament scholarship image of the sources of Luke's Gospel. I mean, what is absolutely clear is, and I'm sure most of you would have seen this kind of versions of this graphic in your studies. Luke's Gospel relies heavily on Mark. About roughly half of, or just under half of Mark's Gospel is in Luke. There's some special stuff, we've just looked over those stories, for which Luke seems to have a particular source. And then there's, whether it exists or not, or whatever it is, there's another source that Matthew and Luke have in common. Is there a problem with me?
It was trying to turn itself off. It's okay, it's sorted, thank you.
So, I mean, I don't need to say anything more to this, but you can see how roughly, whether we have no evidence of Q existence. It's just by deduction that people think there might have been something like that. There are other people who, there is a theory that was big in the 19th century that's now come back, which speaks about the primacy of Matthew's Gospel. But be that as it may, I think the key for us to remember is to see what the things that they share and the things that they don't share that are unique. I think that's what is really helpful to us. I would probably agree with the theory that Luke seems to want to improve, especially linguistically. The Greek is more complicated on Mark's Gospel. If you want to do New Testament Greek, I recommend not starting with Luke, but doing Mark or even John's Gospel. So, who was Luke? He was a Gentile Christian. I don't think there's anyone who really would argue with that at all. There's been a traditional identification of him as the doctor, Colossians 4:14, Luke the beloved physician, and then the companion of Paul, combine that with 2 Timothy, only Luke is with me. There's also the question, of course, whether Timothy is actually Pauline. But others will say, well, Luke 1:1-4, very important introduction. I have not said as much as someone might have done about that. Is definitely looking back on events. Theophilus, is that Luke's patron? Is that the stylized ideal reader? We don't know. And really interesting is a very unclear connection to Paul. Did Luke know Paul's epistles? Paul's theology doesn't seem to have influenced Luke a whole lot. What we do see in the book of Acts, that's the first half of the book of Acts, is all about Peter. The second half of the book of Acts is all about Paul. But as I say, the theology hasn't left a mark in the way we might have expected. So, what are the key themes of the messages? Obviously, and very obvious from that early chapter, from the beginning of Luke 1, Luke presents salvation history. His view is this is a pivotal event in world history. Luke has this universal perspective, and then in the book of Acts, we see how, together with the book of Acts, we see how he has this grand sweep of it starts in Galilee, the pivotal events happen in Jerusalem, and then the gospel goes out to Rome, i.e. to the whole world. Jesus is the Saviour. He's anointed with the Spirit of God. That's where James will come in and pick it up. Luke's Gospel has been called the Gospel of the Spirit. Jesus proclaims salvation to those considered less worthy and outcast, tax collectors, the poor, the women, the Samaritans, the Gentiles. We'll hear more about that from Isabel, no doubt, as well as from Alex. And continuing key themes, there's a narrative theology of the forgiveness of sin. There is in Luke, if you look carefully, no strong doctrine of atonement. And if you now think back to the ancient biographies, Jesus dies a martyr, very clearly, as an example to us. Looking ahead to Acts, all those who will die as martyrs, Jesus in Luke's Gospel says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. That's the way to die. Luke is also very interested in human character. If you compare some of his stories with with Matthew, sometimes the characters there are quite wooden. You know, there's a king and there's a servant and da-da-da-da-da. Whereas in Luke's Gospel, the characters spring much more from the page. The situations are more varied. There's the unfortunate midnight traveller, his unresponsive friend, the corrupt and shifty judge, the poor man covered with sores and befriended by dogs. It's much more coloured in. The characters much more often burst into direct speech as well. It's a different way of telling the story. There is much prayer and piety. Jesus is clearly from a pious Jewish family, and prayer is very, very frequently mentioned in Luke's Gospel. He recounts Jesus himself praying. He has parables about prayer and numerous encouragements of the disciples to pray. there's a recognition that the coming of Jesus, the parousia, is going to be delayed. So therefore, focus on discipleship today. Ascension story. Why do you stand up? Why do you stand there looking upwards to heaven? Your job is to look outward, not upward. And very important as well, the church as the continuation of the people of Israel. That is, of course, what we meet also in Acts. There are tensions in the understanding and interpreting of Luke. Yes, there are lots of women. They are followers of Jesus, but what's the role model? There's been sort of quite significant feminist critique against the sort of huge enthusiasm about Luke reportedly being such an advocate of women in ministry. A lot of the female role models are prayerful, quiet and grateful, supportive of male leadership and not involved, definitely not involved in prophetic ministry. So Luke seems to be trying to steer a quite careful course here. There are the poor, there are some revolutionary and radical texts, but there's also accommodation. Because the rich people, the rich women for instance, Luke 8, they support Jesus. And the relationship to the state. There's a critical loyalty advocated. Yeah, the state is okay, and he certainly shifts blame from Rome to the Jews and the parish passion narrative and the run-up to it. But it is important that they don't hinder worship, freedom of religion and belief. And if that is not given, then we have to stand up against it, which we then have to see, of course, well, both in the Luke and Apocalypse and in the book of Acts. So, my last slide. In conclusion, there's a simplicity in Luke's Gospel. It's a call to community. It's a community in succession of God's people of old and of the apostle. There's a radical commitment to sharing, and the life of faith, perhaps most importantly. The life of faith is a life of prayer. I would add to the slide, a life of prayer in the Spirit, and a life of good deeds. And I just want to end by quoting from a New Testament scholar from Australia, who I rather appreciate, Bill Loader. The relative simplicity of Luke's understanding of salvation, of the life of faith, and of the person of Jesus, unencumbered by the complexities of atonement theories and speculative Christology, makes for powerful communication. It's no wonder that we have all those Sunday school stories in Luke's Gospel. It is a call to community, to be part of the movement of God's people, which finds its central focus in the event of Christ, but depends strongly on that community being able to demonstrate that it stands in an apostolic succession which links it to that event and to its prehistory, the stories of God's people of old. Being Christian means joining the church. In that community there is a radical commitment to sharing and a sense of communion preserved from the rite of breaking bread as there was in the beginning. The life of faith is a life of prayer and a life of